You're listening to the Augmented Experience podcast. My name is Joshua Velez. I'm a student, musician, and a gamer at heart. Join me as I sit down with fellow enthusiasts to talk about what's going on in the technology, business, and gaming world. I hope you guys enjoy. All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Augmented Experience podcast. My name is Joshua Velez, and you guys voted on Instagram, so now we're covering the topic that you guys chose. Today's topic is going to be discussing why has Apple's sales declined in the course of a year. So when we look back in 2018, we were able to notice how Apple ended up becoming the first company in the world to become $1 trillion in market capitalization. Fast forward to now, and I'm currently looking at the current stock value, it is only valued at $154 billion. So how does it drop that bad? How do you go from $1 trillion in market capitalization all the way to $154 billion? Still, $154 billion is $154 billion, which is more money than all of us combined. So what gives? How does a company drop more than 80% of its stock value in the course of a year? Well, I think there's many factors that go into this subject, because when you think about it, if you look at the trend every single year, when Apple is always failing, everybody always goes to the assumption that, oh, Apple's doomed, they're going to fail, they're going to go bankrupt. And then as every year they find out, okay, we're idiots, they're not going bankrupt because they're still making more money than most companies in the world. They're still one of the most successful technology companies on the planet. That's a fact. Like, they make more money than every single company when it comes to smartphone sales, when it comes to tablet sales, when it comes to computer sales. They make a ton of money. Because if you guys haven't realized this, Apple's mostly a hardware company. They mostly make hardware, yet they also own their own software. So it makes sense they're going to charge more money for those products, because not only are they making the hardware, but they're making the software specifically for those products, and they're the ones that own the software. But you get the picture. So we're going to look at a couple articles today. One of them is going to be from the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to quote this article from the Wall Street Journal, where the article talks about Apple's revenue and profit drop. The iPhone has matured, quotation marks. So from this article in the Wall Street Journal, we notice how it talks about the underlying topic, which is revenue for the iPhone declined 15% for the quarter. Revenue from other products and services grew 19%. So there's kind of a contradiction there, because we're noticing how the iPhone sales themselves declined 15% for the quarter. So obviously how the year split up is in quarters. So by 4 months, every 4 months is a quarter. So in this last quarter, obviously the holiday season, the iPhone sales dropped by 15%, which it's kind of weird because iPhones usually sell a lot during the holidays. But let's continue going into the article. As stated by Trip Mickle, who is the author of this article from the Wall Street Journal, Apple Incorporated posted a quarterly decline in both revenue and profit, the first time in more than a decade for the December quarter, underlying the tech giant's challenge to reignite slowing iPhone sales and to depend more on services for growth. So when it comes to this part specifically, it makes sense because everybody in the tech business is currently declining when it comes to value. Samsung dropped more than 15% this quarter as well. And then obviously Google and all of them dropped a good amount. But you can also equate that the stock market is currently in a decline because everybody is losing money. Why is that? There's many factors that can go into it, but mostly sticking to Apple, this was a rough year for them. I'm not going to lie. Not only was this a mid-generation upgrade for the iPhones, but this also was I'd argue was a bad year for products, because there just wasn't that many good products this year from them. Overall, I think the best product they made this entire year was the new iPad Pros. Those were definitely the best things, and the new Apple Watch. Those two alone were single-handedly the greatest things Apple made this entire year, or 2018 when going in that context. And yeah, they made a lot of crap in the process. Like, I will still hold by the opinions. The MacBook Pros are a joke. You currently have a 2017 MacBook Pro. I wouldn't buy a 2018 one. It's a joke. Like, the 2018 is a joke. Like, literally the only way to use that machine properly is to have it in a refrigerator. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be using my laptop in a refrigerator just to make it operate properly. Obviously, they dropped a software update that quote unquote helped the thermals, but the laws of physics dictate otherwise and say that's not how that works. You can't fix, or more specifically, you can't change physics with software because that doesn't make sense. That doesn't add up. Obviously, it helped it a little bit, but software can only go so far to help that issue. And I'm mostly referring to the Core i9 version of the MacBook Pros because those are the ones that had the heating issues. The Core i7 versions didn't have that issue, neither did the Core i5, so those are perfectly fine. And obviously, depending on, I don't know when, if you would consider it when it was really starting to get popular or not, which I don't even think it got popular, was the HomePod. The HomePod, in my opinion, is an absolute joke of a speaker. It sounds great, I'm not gonna lie. But I think its main handicap is that it only runs on Siri, which Siri, out of the three big AIs, is probably the worst out of all of them. Alexa is definitely better, and Google Assistant is on top, and it's better than both of them. Siri is still lagging behind because obviously Apple doesn't want to compromise your security to update Siri, which I think it's fine, but there needs to be a way to update Siri because Siri is severely lacking in regards to AI because it's just not as competent as the Alexa and Google Assistant, which is why I think that handicaps the HomePod because the HomePod can only work with Apple services. So that means only Apple Music, and it can only work with Siri. I think that's a terrible decision because it clearly eliminates any user that uses Spotify because you can't use Spotify with it. So I think that's just terrible that it ended up screwing them over. Now, when we go to the iPhones, this is where things become a little bit interesting because the XR did sell better than the XS and XS Max. Obviously, I think those names are stupid, but the XR sold better. Why is that? So in comparison, the XR is bigger than the XS, but not as big as the XS Max. You know what? Just for time's sake, I'm literally just going to refer to them as the Max and the XS. So just to save myself time and frustration. So the XR was bigger than the XS. Clearly, it was 6.1 compared to 5.8 inches. But it had a bigger battery. And it actually did have a bigger battery, and it actually lasted longer than the Max. Which you guys are probably thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Wouldn't you expect the Max to have the biggest battery? Not even. The XR actually had the biggest battery out of the three, and the reason that is because they lowered the screen resolution. It's not a QHD screen. It's not an OLED, it's an LCD, or the liquid retina as they want to call it. And because of that, the fact that the screen's resolution is lower, that means that the battery doesn't consume as much power, so it makes it last longer. And I think overall, that's what made people think about getting the XR. And that's also because it had the exact same specifications inside as both of them. The only difference is it just didn't have as much RAM, but that's perfectly fine because iOS doesn't really rely on large amounts of RAM to do its job. That's just a fact. It doesn't. iOS can run on 4 gigabytes of RAM when Android phones, in theory, optimal should be 6 to 8, and then some people are already going crazy and putting 10, but that's a thing for another time. But when it comes to the iPhone sales, they declined because, like I said, this is a mid-generation upgrade. People don't want to upgrade. And this also goes down to this quote that I really like, and I think it holds very true to the smartphone market, is that cheap phones are getting good and good phones are getting cheaper. So when you have people like the OnePlus 6 or OnePlus in general coming in, and now they're stepping up their game and they look more as a luxury product now, especially with their partnerships with McLaren and things like that. And the fact that now they're the first Chinese company to sell phones on a US carrier is definitely hurting the iPhone sales in a whole, because now people aren't restricted to, thinking that the iPhone when it comes to software is the king, because I'd argue the OnePlus 6 is just as good and it has really good specifications inside. Obviously, it's not going to have the best camera compared to the iPhones because, in my opinion, the best thing going for the iPhone cameras is that they're great at video quality. They are second to none when it comes to video. When it comes to cameras themselves, like taking pictures, I think the Pixels will always win because the Pixels or more specifically, Google's processing with those pictures is just incredible. They're second to none, and they don't rely on crazy hardware to do it. It's just the pure software experience. But the fact that Apple is struggling so hard to sell iPhones it doesn't surprise me, but it makes sense. I think that people are starting to realize that they don't want to upgrade their phones every year. They're starting to realize that their phones are getting better and better, and now they're getting to the point where their phones are so good, they just don't want to upgrade. They rather wait 2 to 3 years instead of every year, which that's how most smartphone companies survive, is they want you to upgrade phones every single year in order to maintain their business. But I think the smartphone market is currently peaking right now, and I think it's about to dip because, well, phones are just too good right now. There's really not much room to improve on, besides obviously better processors inside and obviously making the cameras better and making the screens better, figuring out a solution to get rid of the notch because we don't want the notch. But that's the state we're in right now, is we just don't know what to do. And it should be alarming, but it also, in this entire process, it's going to make companies think outside of the box and actually innovate again. Because for the last decade, the smartphone market has been booming. It's been increasing and increasing and increasing every single year, and phones have just been getting better and better and better and better as time went by. Like, for example, the Samsung Note line. Let's take that for example. We're at the Note 9 already. The Note 9, I'd argue, is near the pinnacle of Samsung's designs for those phones, which it's crazy to think about. But yeah, the Note 9, I'd argue, has peaked. Obviously, we're waiting on the Note 10, or if Samsung is actually going to continue the Note, but we don't know. We'll figure that out as time goes by. But you can see in the design that there's not really much they can do. Like, if you compare the Note 8 and the Note 9, they look almost identical. You couldn't tell them apart unless if you look at the back. The only way to tell them apart is literally how the cameras are set up and where the fingerprint sensor is, and also the pen. That's it. You can't really tell the difference. And the same thing goes with the Max and the XS when you compare it to last year's X. There's no difference. They look exactly the same. The only way you can tell the difference is just a different color option. That's it. And obviously the Max, obviously it's bigger, but when you're comparing the XS to the X, there's no difference. A color swap and an internal difference, but you can't see the internal difference. And because of that, Apple isn't really able to sell phones as easily as they could before. Same thing goes with Samsung, same thing goes with Google. Obviously, Google doesn't really care. I think it's mostly because they realize that their phones are only enthusiast phones. That's what they're for. That's why they're not focusing on it, because Google's not a hardware company. Google's a software company, which makes products that are hardware, which I'd argue the Pixel phones are probably third best things. I think obviously the Google Homes are some of the best things they've made. And then the Chromecast are incredible too. Those two products alone are probably the main hardware people like from Google. The Pixel phones are very niche. They have a very specific audience, which are the photographers and people that like stock Android, which the main reason is that the Pixels exist is just to be a Android solution to iPhones. Basically to tell iPhone users, hey, you don't want to deal with bloatware like on Samsung phones, then buy our phones. They're smooth, buttery, and they're just like iOS. Well, they look like Androids, but they act like iPhones. Is the main point. That's why they made things like the Pixel Buds, and they made things like the Pixel Slate, which is supposed to be a competitor to the iPad, which it won't. Apple just dominates the tablet game, which is, to be honest, that's never going to change. Like, Apple just makes stupidly good tablets. Obviously, Microsoft's trying to beat them with the Surface Pros, but the difference is the Surface Pro is an actual mini computer, while the iPad Pro is not really meant to be a laptop. And that's another thing that I think it's kind of screwing Apple over in the long run, is their advertising of some of their products. Like, let's go to the iPad. I love the iPad Pro. I think it's one of the best things Apple made, and I think for what it should be used for, it's incredible. Obviously, for artists, it's meant for them, but I would argue that for people that like doing audio engineering or people that like do mobile editing, it's a great option. Obviously, there's a problem with it. It just doesn't have the software needed to efficiently do it. Even though, yes, it does technically in the form of LumaFusion, but the fact that there's a lack of specific things that are needed, say like support for hard drives, that I can't plug in my hard drive into my tablet in order to get my files so I can edit them. I would have to buy an actual mini Wi-Fi router to connect it. And I think that's pretty dumb, because why do I need to buy this extra product just to use something I already have when I can just plug it into my laptop and it works perfectly fine? And I think it also comes down to how they market it, because they're trying to market this as a laptop replacement. The iPad Pro will never replace a laptop. It never will. Like, I can argue it can replace maybe paper and pencil and drawing or taking notes, but when it comes to a laptop, it just can't. Unless if they put macOS on there or like some specific thing on here to make it feel like a laptop and add a proper file manager and make the file manager recognize hard drives, then yes, then we have something on the table. Obviously, people can still do their work, they can still do things, they're just more tedious processes to do it. And it's still effective and it still does the job, it's just you have to do more workarounds to make it work, which is kind of crappy, but I like it and I see why people do enjoy it. And like I said, when it comes to the iPhones, like iPhones are just really good. Like the processors inside of them, specifically the A11 was already ahead of everything else Snapdragon made that entire year. And obviously the A12 is just a monster, which I think really Qualcomm is going to need to step up their game with the 855 to see if that can actually hang with the A12, because the A12 just is a monster. There's a reason why the iPad Pros scored such a high benchmark score when it comes to multi-core and single core, that it scored just as high as MacBooks. Like, a tablet is able to score just as high in a benchmark scores when it comes to multi-core and single cores as a MacBook, as a 2018 MacBook. That's pretty crazy, but you get the point. Apple does make good hardware, it's just they've had a lot of bad luck this year. And when we look at articles like this where it says, still haven't upgraded your iPhone, ? Apple says that's causing poor sales. And this article is from Digital Trends. And when we see how we come up to this point, if I quote this article for you guys, when Apple issues a profit warning, you know something's up. The tech company did that just on Wednesday, January 2nd, with CEO Tim Cook citing a slew of factors weighing heavily on its business during the holiday quarter and heading into 2019. The bottom line is that Apple is currently selling fewer phones than it expected, prompting the company to revise its sales forecast downward for the final 3 months of 2018. In a letter to investors that spooked the market and wiped $55 billion off the market capitalization of the tech colossus, Cook suggested that the company may have missed as much as $9 billion in sales for the quarter. This, he said, was the result of pressure on the global economy and Apple's failure to foresee the magnitude of the economic deceleration, particularly in Greater China. Now, that Greater China part, that specifically is related to the recent iPhone ban in China because of the current trade war going on that we're having with China. And because of that, iPhones aren't, well, more specifically, they are banned in China. Obviously, the newer ones are still for sale, but any older iPhone can't be sold in China. So that means from the 10 down, that can't be sold in China. So the only ones that are being sold in China is the XR, the XS, and the XS Max. Obviously, that causes a huge issue because that's most of Apple's sales being thrown down the toilet because they can't get into China because of the whole trade war. And it's the same thing going on in India as well. Apple just can't sell phones in India because obviously in India, like I said, cheap phones are becoming good and good phones are becoming cheap. In India, a good phone, like you can get a really good phone for $300 and they're fine with that. They're going to stick with that $300. They're not going to pay close to $1,000 plus for an iPhone. They won't. Like some people will, but especially in India, people just don't have that luxury to do that. And as you're starting to see, there's many factors that go into this, and you notice how it causes issues for the company. Obviously, the company is currently in a bad spot, but Apple's still making a ton of money. Like, I hope you guys realize it. Apple's still the number one tech company in the world. They still make like literally billions of dollars every year. Like, that's not even an exaggeration. Apple makes billions of dollars. It isn't millions, it's billions. Apple still makes a profit. Why? Because the US is part of its biggest consumers. We buy iPhones like madmen. We buy MacBooks like crazy people. Like, people buy iPads because they like giving them to children. Why do you think when you go to the mall, you see children playing on iPads? Like, it's crazy. And obviously people buy iPhones, and then because people just don't want to get away from iMessage. I'll admit iMessage is literally single-handedly the greatest piece of software Apple has. iMessage is the main reason people will never leave iPhones, because it is the best messaging app on the planet. It's just ridiculous on how good that messaging app is. And now that I have my iPad Pro, I can use it. Obviously, I do miss it. I'm not going to lie. I love it. And you start to notice how things are not as they always seem. Like, every time people bring up this topic, they always bash Apple. They tell them, oh, they're going to go out of business. Apple's going down. Apple's not going anywhere, guys. Let's just be real. Even if we have a personal bias against them, we still have to give them credit where credit is due. They still were the leading innovators of technology for close to a decade. The original iPhone was an innovation because it made people buy smartphones. Obviously, it didn't do as well, but it was the start of a process. And as time went by, they started to sell more and more and more, and people started to buy into the ecosystem. That's the whole point, is Apple wants you to get into their ecosystem, use their products. Once you have one product, they want you to get another. If you have an iPhone, they probably want you to get an Apple Watch, because that was the first thing they had to add to it, was the Apple Watch. And then they made the iPads, and then they made the MacBooks, and then they made the Pro version of the iPad and the MacBooks. And then obviously they made the AirPods. Like, Jesus Christ. Everywhere I go, I literally see those things. It's ridiculous. But I see why. I personally don't like AirPods. I'm not getting a pair of AirPods. I'm telling you guys that right now. I'm not getting AirPods. I'm perfectly fine with my Jaybird X4s. They sound clearly better than AirPods. They're not as... I don't know if they're just as comfy or even more comfortable, but that's debatable, because some people have different shaped ears, so that's more of a very subjective topic. But you get the point. So, in conclusion, the iPhones not selling as well really isn't as big of a problem as people make it out to be. Do I believe Apple is still going to make a huge profit? Yes, they will. That's every single year. Even though, yes, people aren't buying as many smartphones as much anymore. They're not getting a new phone every single year. Like, that's who Apple wants to target, but they have to start realizing that they can't keep selling phones that way. It just doesn't work, because people don't want to keep buying new phones every single year. People keep holding on to their iPhones every year because they're like, oh, I can get a good amount of years. And the fact that Apple is still supporting the 5S, that's ridiculous. That phone came out in near 2015-ish, 2014-ish, and that phone's still getting software updates. It's on 12.1.3 right now. So a 5-year-old phone is still getting updates. So the fact that Apple's still supporting their phones for a very long period of time, I'd argue is the main reason why people just don't want to upgrade on new iPhones. Now, when it comes to other products Apple makes, that's strictly because sometimes they're crap and sometimes they're good. Like, there's just some flaws that make them not worth the money. And I think that's what people have to realize, is that not every Apple product is going to be a winner. Like I said, the Series 4 watch is clearly the best smartwatch on the planet. It's incredible for what it offers, and I'd argue for its price. I think it's fairly priced. I don't think it's overpriced compared to the competition, when most smartwatches are in the $200, $300, $400 range. So when it comes to things like the iPad Pro, I just think for the iPad Pros, they need to think about a new way of approaching it and how to advertise the product, rather than saying that it's something that it's not. It's not a laptop replacement. It is a laptop companion. That's what it should be categorized as. And also, they really need to figure out a way how to make it feel like a professional product. Like, they put a USB-C port on the new iPad Pros. Why can I not use a USB-C hard drive on that port? That doesn't make any sense. It's directly plugged into it, but because of the file manager not being an actual file manager, it's not reading it. That's why I think they really need to rethink how they want to make the iPad Pro be presented. Obviously, the main reason I think they won't do it is because they don't want to hinder the MacBook sales. If the iPad Pro gets an actual file manager, gets an actual OS and not iOS, but actually, like, say, Mac OS on it, people just won't buy MacBooks. They'll just buy the iPad Pros because they're cheaper, they're just as powerful, and they're more portable. And people just like having more portable stuff, and they have more accessories, which is why I think, Apple won't do it. And that kind of sucks, but we have to work around it. That's why there's already workarounds in place to do that. So I can do work like this with my iPad. obviously, like I said, my iPad Pro is a companion to my laptop. I can do my editing on the iPad Pro, but that's mainly because there's some software on here that allows me to do it, but my main editing should always be on my laptop because it has everything I need to do the job. Obviously, I might experiment here and there to do things like that with the tablet, but that's something for later down the line. But I'm going to leave you guys with that. I hope you guys enjoy this episode. This is a very technical episode, and I just hope you guys had a great time listening to it. I hope you guys keep coming back and keep listening to these episodes, that as I keep preparing and keep getting better and better at the process and becoming more effective at doing it. And at the same time, obviously, I'm learning more on how to edit my audio more clearly, how to be better at doing this stuff, because obviously, like, I'm still new to it. I'm still figuring things out. We're only 4 episodes in, so we got a long way to go, guys. But thank you guys so much for your time. I love you guys to death. You guys take care of yourselves. Have a wonderful week. I love you guys.